Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I got my next post in my Tier 6 series, and upon contemplating this set of 6 albums, I kind of noticed that there's a thread in here, and I've been trying to look for threads as I put these together. Sometimes it's very difficult because some of these albums feel kind of random, but this particular set really shows how music is kind of most powerful, I think, when it comes out of or is elucidating uncertainty. When you have a world in which you seem that you're lost, and it tries to find a direction out of that, or tries to find shape of that. And even though all these albums kind of express this in different ways, I think that thread exists if you're willing to look for it. For example, we'll start off with this first one, the Besnard Lakes, the Coliseum Complex Museum. This is a follow-up to their album, Intel XS Imperceptible UFO. Long title name, but it was one of my favorite albums from my Austin years back when I was living in Austin in the early aughts. And that particular album really struck me because of its beautiful, psychedelic, dream pop crossover. It is both the dream pop, has that dream pop feel, but it's also very psychedelic at its core. What I see the Coliseum Complex Museum as an extension of that idea, but also in some ways a refinement of the idea. And one of the biggest refinements I see on this album is that it's a lot more song-based than its predecessor. It has more form to it. And because it has that form, it has a really more distinct sense of shape. And there's a lot of dream pop albums that I think are very wonderful, but there's sort of a shapelessness to the genre. When you listen to the album, it all kind of has the same dreamlike flow state that goes through it. And certainly if you're looking for that kind of thing, there's a lot of great dream pop that does that. And the predecessor to this album definitely did that. This album also has that, but has more compact forms. And so it has a little bit more sense of shape. And with this more distinct sense of form, you can kind of see the band's influences a little more clearly, especially the Brian Wilson influence. I think it's really impossible to deny that it's really not a Beach Boys feel in this album, although there is that stacked vocal thing. The vocals aren't like 6-part harmony, but they certainly have that very choir boy quality, and they're well arranged, and it really ties them to very classic ideas of pop music. And there's some instrumental things in here, I think, that are very tied to classic rock. When you combine that classic rock and this idea about Brian Wilson, it shows that the band, I think, really has a firm grip on how to use the studio as an instrument. And that's something that I think is particularly pronounced on the Coliseum Complex Museum. Also pronounced, I think, is the lyric content for this album. Because despite having such kind of cosmic grandeur in their music, they have a very natural, earthy feel to a lot of their lyrics. They're tied to the real world, both real world and imagined. You know, there's sort of these imaginary beasts that show up as characters throughout the album. And that really points to this interest, I think, that the Besnard Lakes have in the paranormal. Like, there's almost like a cult, a paranormal obsession on this album that's not explicit, but certainly hinted at. And it provides the album with a lot of very evocative imagery. You know, you have this sense of like this golden forest that you walk through, the mists, and that's not ever explicitly said in the lyrics, but between the dreamlike quality of the music and the sort of naturalistic lyrics, I think there's a meeting point there that kind of pulls that imagery out. And I think that really positions the Besnard Lakes as both songwriters and sonic architects. Now, how is this tying to this idea of being lost? Well, in my mind, the Besnard Lakes is trying to get some form out of this formlessness that you see in a lot of dream pop music. So this was a little bit more esoteric, but I see that they're seeking meaning through shape and structure on the Coliseum Complex Museum. Next I got Consider the Source, The Stare. Consider the Source is a band that I circled around for decades and never really took the bite on until last year I got a chance to see them play live here locally. And they really blew me away, and I found out since then that they are really a live powerhouse band. They play a lot, they play everywhere, they tour constantly, and it really shows in the kind of musicianship and chemistry that they have with each other. Consider the Source is a very unique band. They're all instrumental, they cross over into lots of different things. They call themselves a sci-fi world fusion band. The guitar player plays a 2-neck guitar with MIDI capabilities, and one of the necks is fretless. The drummer is really flexible and versatile player, and the bass player just seems to be there's no technique that the bass player can't pull off. He slaps, he plucks, he taps, Any kind of technique on bass, he seems to really have a mastery of, and he's able to pull it out at a moment's notice when the song asks for it. Now, what makes the Stare unique is that because these guys are such a live powerhouse, most of their music has been produced while they've been playing live. But the Stare was developed in 2020. It started its development period in 2020 during the lockdown period. So it saw Consider the Source having to work in isolation a little bit more. They did a lot more trading of tapes and demos back and forth. So they had a chance to develop this material in a little bit different way. They also had contacted a producer that they'd long wanted to work with, the person who had produced Dream Theater's Images and Words. And he'd always worked in Colorado, and they had always worked in New York City, so they really didn't have a chance to get their paths to cross. But when things started to die down, they sort of took up residence in Asheville, North Carolina, and he met them out there, and they all lived with each other in residence, very old school, to make this album. So as such, the Stare really combines the band's live energy with the precision available in the studio. And many people look at this album and see it as sort of a return to form, because their last couple albums were a little bit more folk influenced, a little bit more playing with these different kinds of ethnic music. This one is a little bit more on the hard rock, gent, progressive rock side. So it's very immediate and it's very virtuosic, and it really cements the band's identity while also evolving it. And the fracture in this music, the sense of being lost, was the pandemic itself that helped to produce this album, the unique conditions that made this album arise, turning that disruption into a new form of creative direction. Next up I got Discipline, Breadcrumbs. Discipline was a band that was kind of part of the third wave of progressive rock, along with big heavies like Spock's Beard, Flower Kings, and Porcupine Tree. Their big breakout album, Unfolded Like Staircase, came out around this same time. And they never quite got the visibility as those other bands did in the long term, but they were kind of big players at the time and got a lot of attention from critics. They had a dark, foreboding style that was really connected to Van de Graaff Generator and that style of dark, prog that was happening in the 70s. The flip side of what was happening with Yes. Now I already see Matthew Parmenter, the lead singer and primary songwriter for Discipline, as like the central figure in this tone. He has an approach to progressive rock that has Peter Hamill's intensity alongside Peter Gabriel's theatricality. Certainly back in this time, whenever they were first coming out, Matthew Parmenter used to wear the white grease paint and took on a stage presence that was very similar to like some aspects of what Peter Gabriel did in Genesis. And that earlier work really emphasized melodrama and stage presence. Now this more current iteration of Discipline, which is the first album they've released in 8 years after a long period of silence, shows them quite a bit more mellowed, I think. Those kind of gritty moments that you heard on Unfolded Like Staircase really don't show themselves as much here. And if you watch videos of Matthew Parmenter singing with them, he's kind of lost the grease paint. He's not really playing up the drama as much. But that's a natural progression with a band that is maturing. There's a continuity to what they're doing, but there's also growth. And that continuity also ties them to progressive rock tradition. Some people even see Discipline at this point in time as a retro prog band. I don't know that I really see that. I don't think they really go for the classic sound that much. But certainly they follow the paradigm that was set forth by original progressive rock. And this most current album too is even more so because there are some markers on it that tie it to the progressive rock tradition. For example, Terry Brown, Rush's early producer, did a lot of the mixing for this album, and Hugh Syme of Rush's fame did the artwork for it. And these things, along with the music, align Discipline with progressive rock tradition. Now, what they haven't let go of from their earlier albums, Discipline, is their album is still really lyrically complex. This is one of Matthew Parmenter's, I think, strengths, because he's very, very strong in the lyric department. This particular album is centered around this idea of breadcrumbs, like, again, we're lost, and breadcrumbs are the way that he's finding his way back. But Matthew Parmenter's idea about being lost is not really just like helplessness. He feels almost like a windswept figure in a malevolent universe being pushed around by the gods, or almost like the gods are against him. So in the context of this album, these breadcrumbs are sort of fragile markings of meaning, but they're not guarantees.
The buzzing flies gone to bed, and when the night calls to day, and echoes come, the only answer, make of the castaway, are holding you to listen to and die.
Next I got George Michael's Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1. This album was released in 1990. I remember very vividly, I was working at Hastings Records at the time, and there are 4 albums that we had sort of in rotation between us. We had Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet. I put in Adrian Belew's Young Lions. 9 Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine was another one. And then there was this one that we all kind of generally had in regular rotation. Of those 4 albums, I purchased the other 3, but I never got around to purchasing this album. And it's one of those albums that I look back and wonder, like, if my life would have been different if I'd have followed the path of listening to this album as closely as I had the other ones. Now, when this album was released, it was a deliberate departure from what George Michael had been known to up to that point. Aside from the sort of lead single, Freedom 90, the rest of the album didn't really follow his normal dance floor pop that he was really well associated and known for, and he had done so well, so successfully on his previous album, Faith. He wanted to be taken seriously, and the album was really critically acclaimed, but kind of fell flat with the audience. I think it was a little bit of a hard translation for him, and unfortunately, all of the momentum that he had in America from Faith, which is such a hugely popular and crucial album for George Michael, kind of stalled in the U.S. But it was a bold pivot in his career arc that he would carry on through the rest of his albums, all the way up until he passed away a few years ago. Now, what I see in this album as I'm going back and checking it out, is I'm remembering how great a singer George Michael actually was. I mean, he's fantastic on this album. His voice is just great. And I was really also thinking back to whenever, after Freddie Mercury had passed on, they did a concert for Freddie Mercury, and he came on and did Someone to Love with Queen. And he was one of the few people, I think, that could have stepped into Freddie Mercury's shoes as the lead singer of Queen and really pulled it off. He was fantastic in that performance, and his vocal ability shines really strongly on this album. And while Listen Without Prejudice Volume 1 probably wasn't as explosively remarkable as Faith was, it still really demands a lot of attention because of its thoughtfulness and its seriousness. Now, in my mind, on this album, the fractured moment that George Michael is working through here is dealing with public expectation versus his own private authenticity. That was really what he put on full display on this album, and it really goes off tremendously well. Next up, I got Oak, The Third Sleep. Oak is an Oslo-based band, kind of in the tradition of Steven Wilson and Opeth, if you include their album Damnation. It's got this dark, atmospheric prog that really emphasizes mood over virtuosity. And one of the things I think that's really distinguishing about this album is the vocal approach that the lead singer takes. He's got a low, kind of gritty voice that reminds me a lot of the lead singer from Shearwater, but in a more progressive rock format. And I particularly like this because it diverges from the progressive rock norm of kind of more high operatic vocals and really cements the band's identity and their diversity from within the progressive rock scope of today. Another way in which I think they diverge a little bit from the progressive rock, normal ideas of progressive rock, is they have kind of a folk adjacent feel to them. You've heard this from other, I think, Norwegian bands that have this, progressive rock adjacent feel. There's a very strummy feel to this music. It feels like it was probably essentially composed mostly on acoustic guitar, which would be unusual, I think, for most progressive rock because of this sort of normal florid instrumental nature. But all these distinguishing factors, I think, give the aesthetic of the album a real intimate feel, but merges it with a really like restrained, almost spectral scope. I would almost call these guys to a certain extent like a dark side elbow. Now, lyrically speaking, I think The Third Sleep is an exploration of societal complacency and individual struggle. And that adds an existential depth to their music, I think, that is coupled with the broad scope that they're using sonically on the album. And I think if you look at the lyrics in this album, that's where this sense of fracture, making sense out of being in a lost space comes out. They really make it the main topic of the lyrics in this album if you look closely enough at what they're saying.
Swim in your white dress, it weighs you down. Shimmering light says, I want you drowned. And you will be gone when your night crawls out of my shadow as they're holding on. Open mouth, mute cries in the water.
And finally I got Stevie Wonder's Innervisions. This album was released in 1973 when Stevie Wonder was 23 years old, and it was his 16th album. I mean, do your math on that. Now, keeping in mind that Stevie Wonder was coming from the hit factory of Motown. This was his background, where cranking out albums was the name of the game, and people would throw you songs. There wasn't a whole lot of original music that a person would do in that setting. Same was the case for Stevie Wonder. People would write him songs, he would do covers, and crank out album after album after album. But by the time he got to the 70s, Stevie Wonder was walking away from that idea and really looking at his own material and his own potential as an artist. And on Innervisions, you see his emergence, I think, of as an adult, like as an actual grown-up version of Stevie Wonder. Little Stevie Wonder is long gone at this point, and he's really looking at taking a mature view of his own music and the subjects that he's tackling. And what he's really looking at in this album, in my view, is the cultural disillusionment of the 60s. You know, by the time 1973 rolled around, there was all these promises made in the 60s of what the world was going to be like. And 1973 comes around, a lot of those promises didn't really come to pass. And a lot of the resistance music that you hear in the early 70s kind of addresses that issue. So Stevie Wonder started to position himself at this point as a social commentary as much as an entertainer. Now, as he's sort of delving into this classic period of his albums, this 5-album stretch, that Innervisions sort of is the centerpiece of, you see him start to also get involved with more experimental stuff. One of the main sounds on this album, I think, that's unique to a lot of Stevie Wonder's work at this time was his introduction to the Tonto synthesizer. This is a very early synthesizer, predates even the Moog instruments. But it really encouraged him to experiment more with layering and also wrest some artistic control onto his own music. And as a result, he wrote every lyric on this album. He played every single instrument, and encouraged by his producers at the time, really gave himself full artistic autonomy on Innervisions. And it paid off for him. This particular album was really well received by the critics and won a Grammy Best Album of the Year for 1973. It was a landmark album when it came out, and it really cemented Stevie Wonder's position as a visionary for soul music and music in general going forward.
Keep on turning, 'cause it won't be too long. Oh no, I'm so darn glad he let me try it again, 'cause my last time on earth I lived a whole lot of sin. I'm so glad that I know my man, I know that gonna keep on trying till I reach the highest ground.
So what I see unifying these albums is not style so much as struggle. Each of them shows a different facet, a different way of dealing with the struggle, either by writing about it or showing that there's a way through that's positive, like Stevie Wonder's Innervisions. Or maybe it's just fighting the creative obstacles that show up in the process of making the album. All these things are different aspects of struggle, and these albums, I think, share that, despite the disparity in their styles. And that's all I got for you guys this time around. So if you like this video, like and subscribe, share it out with your friends, follow me over on Spotify. I've got all these tracks up on a huge list that just keeps growing and growing all the year long. You should go check that out. And if you want to be involved with finding the best albums that I've been listening to over the course of this year, please sign up my Patreon below. And until you see you next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.